Well, indeed, the military has had its hands full with support from police and other security agencies, no doubt. But in spite of all that, insecurity still remains a major challenge. That's 6 years into the Buhari government. Why, you ask? Well, we invited the Defense Ministry to give us an insight into this nagging question and more on the program tonight. But we were told an urgent assignment came up, so we'll be doing that interview in the coming days, hopefully. But in the meantime, we're joined by an intelligence expert and former director at the DSS, as well as a security expert. Mr. Mike Ejiofor is a former director at the DSS. You see him there, joining us from our Abuja studio. And right next to him is Mr. Kabiru Adamu, a security consultant. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program. Let me begin with Mr. Ejiofor. I wonder for you if you ever get asked that same question as to why insecurity lingers. And at this point, it seems to be entering more dangerous dimensions. For you, is there a simple answer to that question?
Well, there's no simple answer to such a complex security situation. Why not trying to defend it? You see, we were talking of insurgency, terrorism. A lot of countries have fought this war over years. But our own is peculiar, and I think with government efforts in trying to solve the problem, I think we should be able to look inwards and see how we can re-strategize. If you recall that calls have been made for change of service chiefs, and service chiefs have been changed, the Inspector General of Police changed, and there's a new strategy. But my worry actually is the claims by the military. I think they should be backed up with pictorials. You know, when we hear that 100 people have been killed, 200 people have been killed, 800 bandits, some people have surrendered, and yet the attacks continue. So it calls to question, what are we now doing wrong? I take, for instance, the issue of the banditry in the Northwest. Like you said in your intro, the banditry in the Northwest, if you recall that the National Assembly has called on the government to classify these people as terrorists. Only yesterday, the Conference of Speakers also made the same call. Some governors have made the same call. So I think the government should now take it seriously by looking at the processes of declaring these bandits terrorists, because there's little difference. There's a thin line between banditry and terrorism. What I mean is that both parties use violence, threat of violence, but you know, for terrorism, it has a political aim. For academics, yes, people will argue that banditry should not be classified as a terrorist group. But if you look at the way they're operating, because banditry is about kidnapping, taking hostages, extorting money, but these people have gone beyond that. They've gone to the extent of even bringing down an aircraft, blowing up our rail line, and this has brought government to disrepute and making government look incompetent. So I think it is the right time for us now, for the government to take necessary steps to classify these people for whatever it is. Because if you ask me, not necessarily that once they are classified as a terrorist group, then the fight will end. No. But at least it will get sympathy of the international community that Nigeria is serious about the fighting terrorism, and possibly will get more support. Recall that also we have had some support, the Tucano aircraft, but it goes beyond aircraft. Because what we are facing is just not like, you know, in Nigeria lexicon, we always have issues. We talk of kinetic and non-kinetic. We are laying more emphasis on kinetic approach. But I believe that non-kinetic approach will address some of these issues, especially the issue of Boko Haram. Don't also forget that Boko Haram is a terrorist group and the fourth or third most dangerous terrorist group in the world. So
right.
If we combine it with banditry and all this, we'll have a complex situation in our hands.
So I see you've taken a dive into, I mean, one of the cores of the discussion tonight. Let me bring in Mr. Adamu to get his side to this. Now, he says that there's no simple answer as to why we have this nagging problem of insecurity, which seems to be metamorphosing as the days go by. So for you, I mean, we'll get into the part about, you know, banditry, terrorism, and all of that. But for you, what is the complex answer to why we still have this nagging problem of insecurity?
Okay, thank you, Kayode. Good evening. For me, this insecurity challenge is actually a symptom of some structural deficiencies that we have within the country. Political deficiencies, structural deficiencies, economic, as well as social. So I'll quickly mention what I mean by this. The socio-economic grievance that is at a very high rate across the country at the moment. So you have, for instance, the Southeast not happy that they've not been given a chance to govern, as it were, rule the country. You've got, at the subnational level, certain ethnic groups within certain states who are very unhappy because the composition, or the dynamics within the state would never allow them to become governors. A game of numbers, a game of inability to play politics. So all of these political, socio-economic grievances are driving some of the challenges we're seeing. Then economic exclusion, the rate of poverty, the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots is also a very huge issue that's the driver of insecurity. And then, of course, if you look at the difference between certain states, in the north, my state, as an example, will have a percentage poverty rate of 87% according to MBS. And then you go to Lagos, you have 4%. How many youths are moving between Sokoto and Lagos in search of greener pastures? Then you bring the next point, which is the social grievances that are driven by sometimes hate messaging and hate speech. This movement is economic, but then the interpretation of the movement is given another dimension and, in fact, hated. And so that greener pasture they're looking for, unfortunately, they end up not having it. So that's one. Two is the lack of opportunities that is almost dominant within the space completely. Then we can also talk of weapons proliferation, which is a huge issue. And you mentioned the report by The Economist. It spoke about that. Perhaps maybe in the course of the conversation, we'll expand that. Then our borders that are porous. And then, of course, the biggest elephant in the room, our criminal justice system that does not arrest or punish offenders. Now, this is the reason. So no matter how you deploy security forces, even if we have 2 million military men in Nigeria today and another 5 million police, and these issues, these core issues that I've mentioned are not addressed and others, then we're still going to have insecurity. Of course, I haven't even spoken about corruption. It's also another driver of insecurity. So in direct response to your question, we are not addressing the root causes of insecurity. What we're doing is merely, I would describe it as cosmetic. We see the symptoms. We attempt to use boots on the ground to address those symptoms without necessarily addressing those root causes. And until we address those root causes, unfortunately, the issues would continue to grow.
Contextualize this issue of insecurity. I mean, just this morning, 17 persons were killed by armed gunmen in Mashegu local government area of Niger State. Last week, 43 people were killed in Goroyo Market, gruesomely, in Sokoto, by bandits, so-called bandits. Now, these incidents are not normal, and that's just two of series of incidents we've seen just the past few days across the country. And back to the conversation that Mr. Ejiofor got into, which is one of the solutions which has been consistently proffered in recent times is that the government declare bandits as terrorists. So we've seen the Senate, the House of Representatives, state speakers, as Mr. Ejiofor said, even governors like Governor El Rufai of Kaduna State saying that declare bandits as terrorists. So seeing the the Hydra-headed challenge of insecurity, the multifaceted, nature of this insecurity, just how much of a big deal or how big a solution is this one that is being proffered in the whole scheme of things?
Well, Like I said, it's not going to bring an immediate solution.
Pardon me, Mr. Ejiofor. Pardon me. You'll come in a bit, but this is for Mr. Adamu. Please allow Mr. Adamu to respond, and I'll come back to you. Thank you. Mr. Adamu, please go ahead.
So I can go international. I run a consultancy, and we've delved deeply into this topic. But let me, for purposes of time, let me restrict myself to our local laws. That is the Terrorism Prevention Act as amended 2013. Section 3, subsection 1 of that act defines, in a very broad manner what terrorism means in Nigeria. And it says that any malicious act which aforethought that causes grievous harm either to a nation or to an organization. So the question, and this is for the courts to actually interpret, is the actions of these bandits, are they malicious? Are they were they premeditated? And then have they caused grievous harm to the country or to any organization? And I'm sure lawyers and the courts will have their say in that. But for me, my role as a security risk management and intelligence specialist is to analyze what brought them and why is it that, like in the case of Zamfara, for almost 11 years, they have been active and we've not been able to manage their activity. And I'll tell you, naming them terrorists, yes, it will provide the platform for us to address the challenge. But my worry is to address this big question: who is a bandit at the moment? So much has been said about who is a bandit. In fact, the nomenclature has been so loosely used that in the Northwest, that same group carrying out that same activity is called a bandit. If you go to another part of the country, he or she is given a different name. So the worry, and this has been reflected in the research that I told you we did by my consultancy, Beacon Consultancy. You have communities of herders, and that perhaps, and this is likely, where you have a mixture of genuine herders and perhaps a few elements that are involved in banditry. Now, if you declare, for instance, the group terrorist, is the implication to use a fighter jet or a Super Tucano, for instance, to go and drop a bomb in that community in an attempt to get rid of that. So it brings its own complexity. And that is why in our recommendations, we said one of the first things to do is to disaggregate the challenge, separate as best as possible, a very difficult task, but it's doable. The bandits from the militias, quote and unquote, that are involved in herding, and then, of course, the criminals that are also involved. Very difficult.
I wonder,
doable.
I mean,
at the end of the day,
I mean, true to what you said, I just wonder how easy that will be. But in fact, you just said it's going to be very difficult separating. But just to, shed more light for our viewer watching right now, let's take a look at the definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Prevention Act. While, I mean, the definition of banditry might be different across board, but at least we know what the Terrorism Prevention Act says is terrorism. So there you see Section 2 says, act of terrorism means an act which is deliberately done with malice, aforethought, and which, so Part A says, may seriously harm or damage a country or an international organization. And it goes on. And you see C says it involves or causes, as the case may be, an attack upon a person's life, which may cause serious bodily harm or death. Goes ahead to talk about kidnapping of a person. Part 3 says destruction of a government or public facility, a transport system, an infrastructure facility, including information system. And it goes on and on. It talks about the seizure of an aircraft, ship, or other means of public or goods transport. It talks about the manufacture, possession, acquisition, transport, supply, or use of weapons, explosives. Mr. Ejiofor, I mean, the Terrorism Prevention Act is quite clear when it defines acts of terrorism. And looking at the activities of bandits, do you see a similarity?
The banditry all have elements of terrorism as is constituted in Nigeria now. But the only problem I have, you see, like Kabir said, segregating them, getting the people separated, is going to be difficult because they operate in ungoverned spaces. These bandits employ violence, kill people, bomb, bring down aircraft, and that's public transport. Also blow up a rail line. You see, we are looking at this as just a simple matter. Suppose the train that was carrying passengers ran into the and derails. Do you know the number of lives that will be lost? So it's not something, these are terrorists. As far as I'm concerned, we should just not shy away from it by calling them bandits. The government should follow the due process in the Terrorism Act, go to court and declare these people terrorists. And I think, like I said, it's not going to bring an immediate solution, but at least the entire international community will also look at Nigeria as being serious. You cannot declare one group terrorist organization and leave the other. These bandits have done more harm than any other group, even more than Boko Haram. And I stand to be corrected. Boko Haram has been operating within the Northeast. Now, Borno, I think, in 3 states. But in the Northwest, they're operating they are virtually taking over Niger State. They're operating in Zamfara. They are in Katsina. They're in Kaduna. They're in Sokoto. So they have taken more wider dimension than the Boko Haram that have already been declared a terrorist organization. So I think we should pursue that course to make sure these people are declared a terrorist and use maximum force, not minimum force now, to get these people to get a sanity in the polity, because 2023 is coming. And if we continue like this, we're having an election in Anambra State, and there is threat to that election because of the activities of the IPOB. These agitations, like I said, agitations in the Northeast, in the Southwest, in the Southeast, the governments need to, apart from all these issues of kinetic approaches, bombing, using jackboots and all this, we need to convene possibly a national conference where all parties will come together and state their grievances. We don't have time on our hands.
So, Mr. Jofo, are you saying also that...
So we don't have time on our hand.
You know, in terms of the, I mean, on the back of the national dialogue, which you talk about, are you saying that even the bandits should be invited also to state their cause as to, you know, why they're perpetrating these acts? Is that what you mean?
You see, you are aware that some state governments have invited bandits. People are in contact with them. I'm not suggesting that we should get them involved, but there are people who also are in touch with them. So they should rein them in and talk to them on the futility and of what they are doing, destabilizing the country. For the Southeast, for instance, and the Southwest, where you have known leaders. But in this banditry and Boko Haram, you see, it has also been internationalized. We have ISWAP, we have ISIS and the other affiliations. And we need to look at our local content and see how we can solve this problem.
You know, I just...
international. This banditry in the Northwest is very, very disturbing.
You know, I wonder the propriety of that as well. I mean, when you recall the governor of Katsina actually saying that with benefit of hindsight, because we've seen governors actually offer, what is it, amnesty of sorts to bandits. And he said that with the benefit of hindsight, it would not have, you know, gone through with that process of amnesty to bandits. I mean, seeing that most of them even go back and become worse eventually. Let me take this back to Mr. Adamu. So, I mean, there are challenges about what exactly to do. I mean, the carrot and stick approach, is it maximum force? Is it dialogue? I mean, you've heard governors, in fact, a certain governor of Kaduna State saying, in fact, the military should go into the bushes, the forest, and eliminate, neutralize anybody found in those forests. Now, there were questions about collateral damage and the rest. So a lot of options on the table, but how do we maneuver this?
Coyote, I started by reeling out what I call the drivers of insecurity. And I mentioned that the elephant in the room is the weak, ineffective, and inefficient criminal justice system, where you have a situation where offenders carry on with their offenses and they are not arrested, they are not prosecuted, then unfortunately the deterrence element within every criminal justice system is no longer serving the purpose that it should serve the purpose. So I don't want to pick up one issue and stick to it. So as an example, going into the forest, for me, is an act in futility. For the simple reason is that forest that we're talking about straddles about 5 states. And not only 5 states, it goes into another country. So when you go into that forest, and in most times you announce it that you're going into that forest, before you even go there, most of them would have left. The people you are likely to meet there are innocent people who don't have the capacity and capability to move. So why don't you now do a holistic approach where you use the entire instrument of our national power? There are 27 MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies in security. Then we also have the capability through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to contact these neighboring countries, and then the multilateral agency of ECOWAS to now make sure that whatever approach we're doing is holistic. I don't want to start discussing issues that I know will just end in futility. It has to be holistic. It has to be born out of intelligence, and it would have not just intelligence by the military, but the entire intelligence community. I'm sure Mr. Ejiofor can speak better about that. But the idea, the point I'm trying to make is, unless we carry out these actions in a holistic manner and not just knee-jerk approaches where we look at those core drivers of insecurity, then unfortunately you will invite us again, I'm sorry to say, in a couple of years, with Mr. Ejiofor, and we'll still be speaking about it. We need to look at the issues holistically. We need to address the drivers of insecurity before we can start talking about containment. We're not even discussing containment. That's what worries me. The approaches are not necessarily that of containment. They are not intended, for instance, to end the challenge, as it were. They are merely there to prevent for the period. And then, of course, because it's impossible to sustain those efforts that we're seeing currently, were challenged, in terms of the ability of the government to fund some of those security operations that are ongoing. Right. So they are going to stop after a period. And when they stop, the groups, actors will regroup, and then we're back to where we are, unfortunately.
Well, Mr. Adamu, I certainly don't look forward to having this sort of conversation with you in the coming years. And I think it will be important to state some of those issues. We'll never get tired of ensuring that those solutions are put forward. So we're rounding off in about 2-3 minutes. So, gentlemen, when you say, for example, Mr. Adamu, that we need to tackle this holistically, the president had a meeting with heads of the security apparatus, and the issues were raised. In fact, the Anambra election was raised as well. The president saying that the election must hold, even if it means that the security agencies will overwhelm the state and ensure that the election would hold. So we have these meetings from time to time. The question now is, if we don't want this to end in an exercise in futility, as Mr. Adamu has said, Mr. Ejiofor, who should champion this? I know this is a question that has been raised, but if we're not getting the kind of results we should get, who then should champion this?
Well, you see, the issue of championing is the government, because the primary purpose of government is security and welfare of the people, as enshrined in our Constitution, Section 14(2)(b). Now, the government should champion this. And if you look at some statements coming from top government functionaries, uncoordinated statements, it is even generating more problems. Some people will come and tell you that they will declare a state of emergency in Anambra State. Do they have such authorities to say that? And the president will come out to tell you the election must go on. So there needs to be coordination of people talking on behalf of government, because this is also heating up the polity. People will be accusing some top government functionaries of it. So we should be constructive. Not only government functionaries, we should also caution our politicians on the way they make statements, because these statements they make are capable of, inflaming passion and making the situation worse. So we all hands must be on deck, but government is the major driver to ensure that there's security in the country.
And especially all hands must be on deck. And just to be clear, I think the Attorney General said particularly that the option of emergency is on the table, not particularly saying it will be declared. But Mr. Adamu, your closing thoughts on this in terms of championing this cause. If you can do this in 30 seconds.
Okay, unlike my co-discussant, I see government as involving both the federal, the state, and local government, and then, of course, the three arms of government, the executive, the legislative, and judiciary. So I think I mentioned earlier on that our national power needs to come together. All of these levels of government, all of these different attributes of government needs to be brought together to address this. And for that purpose, I'm advising that an expanded National Security Council that would involve governors and perhaps even ex-presidents and some, if possible, traditional rulers be invited, so that our leadership can have this discussion and agree among themselves. When certain governors come out and make certain statements that they should never do, let them say it in that council, and then let the issues, if it's a grievance, let them address it, so that by the time they come out, what we as Nigerians will see is a single leadership, irrespective of political differences, and at least for the purpose of solving this security challenge. I think that would help reduce some of the tension that we're having at the moment, and I'm sorry to say deficit in leadership, especially at some subnational levels.
Well, gentlemen, quite instructive action points you have given us. Mr. Mike Ejiofor, former director at the DSS, as well as Mr. Kabiru Adamu, security consultant. We'd like to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the program.